Well,
Yeah, it went quite quickly.
They were very grateful.
And, a med surge floor that lost 5 patients in a day. Med surge isn't used to losing that many patients in a day, if ever. Usually they can send them to ICU before they really deteriorate. So our nurses are going through an awful lot, and our grief center is picking up the pieces. So
thank you.
I'll introduce Marjorie.
Yes, go ahead, Janet.
I'm Janet Montgomery. I was the Chief Marketing Officer for Hospice of Cincinnati up until last week, and I just made a change, and now I'm the nurse manager of our intake and admissions department. So I stepped down from senior leadership for the last couple of years of my career, and I have worked with Marjorie for a couple of years now. Marjorie has extensive experience in palliative care. Before she came to HOC, she was most recently a palliative care social worker at Christ Hospital. And prior to that, she worked on early onset Alzheimer's programming for the Alzheimer's Association. She was recognized as having significant talent in management and leadership, and has been the supervisor of our grief center. And so she has really complete oversight of our grief center, and she's rebuilding the team and the programming, and we couldn't be more happy. She's delightful. I can't say enough about Marjorie. Our grief center is the best in class grief services in our region for sure, and one of the best in class in the nation. What we do is different than what any other hospice does. And the amount of patients that we see on an annual basis is just kind of staggering. So we care for over 5,000 patients a year. And if you consider each one of those patients has 3 or 4 loved ones who are grieving, that is a tremendous amount of grief. And sometimes it goes unattended to. And so there's silent grieving out there. And now we're in COVID, and it just expounds the grief that we feel. So I'll let Marjorie take over. I apologize that I have to sign off. I have to go through EPIC training, which is our new computer system. And if anybody's in healthcare, it's a great time for all.
Yeah.
But Jane, thank you for inviting us. And I think you're really going to enjoy Marjorie.
Thanks, Janet.
Thank you, Janet.
Thanks, Janet.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Before Marjorie begins, I'm going to ask a few of you who are not yet to please mute yourselves so that we can just be hearing Marjorie. Thank you.
Oh, thank you everyone for the warm welcome. I'm so happy to be here. As Janet mentioned, I've been with Hospice of Cincinnati for 3 years. I was a field social worker on the East Field team, working in home care as well as long-term care for about 2 years. And then I took over this role a year ago in March. So actually, I think I started on March 1st, and by March 13th, we were in lockdown and changed our programming significantly. So I think, like everybody, it's been a whirlwind. I feel like we're in the 13th month of March, and hopefully have our hopefully the end is in sight in terms of COVID, but we have some ways to go. So I have a presentation that I created, a general overview of some thoughts about grief, loss, and mourning. Jane and I talked, and I would, if possible, prefer this to be very conversational. This is a perfect size group. I think that we can kind of share thoughts and feelings, questions while I am talking. And so I would encourage you, jump in, interrupt me if you have something to add, if you have a question. Please, I would encourage you to definitely jump in and let your voice be heard on this. Let me share my screen. I'm becoming slowly but surely more proficient at good old Zoom sharing. So I wanted to give you all, just to get started, a general overview of the Goldstein Grief Center. So the Goldstein Grief Center has 2 parts. We have the grief services. I'm the supervisor of the grief services. Our grief services program provides individual counseling for family members of Hospice of Cincinnati patients for up to 13 months following the loss. We currently are not seeing community clients, and that is just because of we had to furlough 3 people, so we're in the process of rebuilding our staff. But my hope would be that in the coming months, we will again be able to see community clients. So these might be clients whose family members were not associated with Hospice of Cincinnati, who might have lost a person to a car accident, suicide, or a very quick traumatic loss, or just weren't associated with Hospice of Cincinnati and another hospice, and we're happy to see them as well. So that is on the back burner now, but we do hope to be able to get back to seeing community clients, because it is part of our mission that we are serving the community in grief as well. We have support groups for Hospice of Cincinnati families as well as community members. Our support groups are open to anyone in the community, and we're really making a big push here to increase our support groups and make the program more robust. As Janet was saying, we are really trying to pivot to work with our families who have lost loved ones due to COVID. We are starting a COVID support group for people who lost their loved ones to COVID. We are in the process of meeting with our chaplain team tomorrow to talk about a workshop for folks who currently have people in a skilled nursing facility who are impacted by the restrictions of COVID. So for those who, you can't go visit mom or grandma or dad because of COVID, you're doing the window visits, to talk to them about ways for anticipatory grief, advocating for those clients. So we're really trying to do to address the need of folks who are grieving during COVID, either from the loss from COVID itself or who are impacted due to the restrictions on COVID. One of our cool programming that I'm so excited about is we are committed to doing some very special topic workshops at least a couple times a year. We do one for around the holidays, grieving around the holidays. We have plans to do a mindfulness and grief workshop. I have an exciting partnership with another social worker I know to try to do a writing group. There's some local authors who have done writing groups for grieving people, so maybe have some workshops with writing groups. My goal is to be able to address grief not only from an individual counseling perspective, but also from the perspective of working together as a community. I find that support groups are so powerful for people, and it is so healing to hear other people going through similar things. So we're really trying to make our programs more robust. We do memorial services twice a year for our Hospice of Cincinnati families. We did a virtual memorial service. We were called upon to be very creative this year, and our manager of support services did an amazing job putting up a virtual a virtual memorial service on our website. And then Fernside. Fernside is Vicki Ott is the executive director of Fernside, and she's my one-up, and she's in charge of all of us. Fernside does an amazing job working with kids from the ages of 3 to 18 and their parents or guardians. Fernside provides all group expressive art programs. They do amazing work in the community in terms of crisis response to schools when there's been a death of a student or a beloved teacher. I've personally have friends who have their children have gone through Fernside and cannot say enough about the program that they offer. So as Janet said, we definitely have a very robust grief services at Hospice of Cincinnati. Hospices under Medicare guidelines are charged with providing grief services. Some folks will send letters and maybe one phone call, but we're very proud to be able to offer the services that we do to our grieving folks. So that's kind of an overview of what we do. I wanted to just talk a little bit kind of from the beginning about, sorry guys, how am I forwarding this? I don't know, Jane, it's not forwarding for me. Let me try something here. Oh, okay. So I wanted to talk about some definitions, if you will, not to get too into semantics, but I think it is interesting to look at the different words associated with loss, grief, and mourning. I first did want to point out this sculpture. This is a piece of art in Geneva. and it was called Melancholy. It was done by an artist after he lost his wife. I showed this at one of the support groups, and it resonated so much with folks. I can't tell you how many times people come into my office and they put their hand on their chest and I feel like I have a hole here, or it feels like I'm something is missing. And I actually had a gentleman in one of my support groups. I showed this this slide, and he went out and he bought clay and he made his own version of this. And he said it was just so therapeutic for him to be able to do this, because he resonated so much with this sculpture. So loss, it can be physical, it could be symbolic. I think we all know, the loss of a job, the loss of moving. There are many, many losses in addition to losing a loved one, a family member. Symbolic losses too, people who are maybe retiring when they weren't ready to retire, they're, downsized, are all very much real losses that can cause a grief process. Loss of pets. I think sometimes pets are family, and I think that we oftentimes maybe undermine or don't give that enough weight to the grieving process associated with that. And then grief. Grief is the psychological, social, and somatic reaction to the perception of the loss. It's a normal reaction, it's a universal experience, and it's repeatedly encountered. I like this definition because it does talk about the multifactorial, how the variables that are in grief. It's not only emotional. There's social changes that come with loss. There's somatic reactions. People have real physical reactions to the loss. Also, I like it because it's normal reaction. Grief is not pathological. It's not a mental illness. It's not a person not being strong. It is what happens when we have to move forward in a world without a loved one. And then mourning. And mourning is the cultural response to the loss. So it's a reaction influenced by social and cultural norms and expectations. And I think when we think about mourning, we think about, the burial rituals, rituals of clothing that some cultures have, wearing black, rituals of who can see who, rituals of who might, timing of burial. My critique would be that our culture, America, does not a great job with mourning. We expect people to, feel better in a couple months. I think most big organizations will give you 3 bereavement days. So I think that we don't do a great job of acknowledging major losses that happen in people's lives. I think in general, we can be a death-denying culture, so it's not something we want to look at or think about. And thus, when people do go through something, oftentimes they feel isolated, they feel like they're alone, they feel like they're crazy if they're not, getting over it in the amount of time that maybe their people around them feel like they are prescribed to do. I like this. I show this to my clients a lot. We're actually getting this made in into a big canvas in our office, how we want grief to work and how grief actually works. And I think when I show this to clients, they immediately like, oh yeah. People often ask me, like, how long will I feel like this? When will I feel better? And what I can tell folks, and sometimes when they're right in the midst of that heavy grief, I ask them to trust me that they will feel better, that I can't tell them a time frame. I don't know that, but I can tell them based on, the hundreds of people I've worked with that they do feel better. We always hear that, time heals all wounds. I would add to that it's also what you do with the time. So if you are taking that time to really do the work of grief, to mourn, to express those feelings, then time does help. I have worked with some people who, for whatever reasons, myriad of reasons, have not processed their grief and thus might come to our offices 2-3 years later and are very much needing to start that grieving process from the beginning. Some of the variables that come with how people grieve the dying process. Was this a sudden loss? Was it a long illness? Can impact how people grieve. I've worked with some folks who there might have been a long illness, albeit cancer or dementia, who have done a lot of anticipatory grieving. And so when the person passes, they might be, further along in the grieving process than people might imagine, because they've done so much of the grief work prior to the death. Certainly sudden losses, traumatic losses can really impact how a person, the grieving journey, if you will, looks for them. And then the nature of the relationship. I've worked with a number of kids or adult children, if you will, who parent died and that parent might have been very abusive to them. And they are shocked by the fact that they're grieving the loss of them. And so, the variables that go into how you grieve oftentimes is in relationship to the person you lost and what was your relationship with them. And it can be complicated at times. I'm going to pause here if there's anybody have any comments to throw in or any questions about anything I've said thus far. Okay, feel free to jump in, y'all. The quote on the side was from one of my clients, a young woman whose mom died of cancer. It was a couple year illness. And she said this to me and I was just so floored, and it just made such sense. And I hear this from a lot of people. I was prepared for her death, but not for her absence. So people can do that anticipatory grief work in terms of preparing for the death. But then when that person is not there, that is hard, if not impossible, to prepare for. So people often say in my office, I thought I was prepared. I thought I was ready. And, I kind of point to this as a quote and they go, oh, yes, I was prepared. But how do you get used to that absence in terms of, something happens and they're who you want to call? It's almost that automatic reaction, and then you realize they're not here. So I thought that was a very insightful quote. I wanted to just touch base on some of the theoretical frameworks of grief and mourning. There have been a lot, if you can imagine. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I think she's probably the most well-known. She actually wrote her 5 stages of grief initially for a dying person. The denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. After she wrote her first book, we began to use that as the 5 stages of grief for a person who is mourning. She also, I think, would be the first to say, and did say in later years, that she did not intend for her framework to be a linear framework, which is, I think people oftentimes will come in and say, okay, I'm done with denial, and I want to check that box. When if we look back, it's not linear. Sometimes you circle back. You might be angry for a while and then that subsides, but then you might feel angry at another time. So definitely not linear. Dr. Roberta Thames, hers is the 3 stages of grief: numbness, disorganization, and reorganization. So the initial shock of the loss, I think people will say, when you're going through preparing for the funeral, doing the business of death, i.e., estates and probate and whatnot, people will say, I just feel like I'm a zombie. I'm just kind of going through the motions. And then the disorganization of what does my life look like now? What is my new normal? People, will state that they feel like they're going crazy. And then ultimately reorganization. So the short of it would be getting used to the new normal. What does our new normal look like? Who am I now that I've lost my partner? I've lost my mom, my dad, my sister, my brother. So I think that that's a good model in general, that people do fit into that. And then I think probably one of the more recent is the dual process model of coping. And what that talks about is that there are two responses that people kind of ping pong back: loss-oriented responses, and that would be the crying, the yearning for the individual, thinking about the loved one, to the restoration-oriented responses. And those are, learning new tasks, learning how to take care of the budget if that wasn't what you used to do. It's sort of focusing on the day-to-day to rebuild your life. And then people go back and forth. Some days you might have a good day. You might feel so proud that you were able to accomplish A, B, or C that you had meant to do, and you feel a little bit hopeful about life. And the next day, boom, feeling just crushed and mourning. And what I think naming this for some people, because folks will say, I feel like I'm on a roller coaster. One day I'm fine. The next day, I see the price of bananas at Kroger's and it throws me for a loop because I would pick them up for mom. And I think a lot of the power of the frameworks is to normalize what people are going through, not to make it pathological at all, or to talk about it as any type of mental illness, but just to look at it in terms of these are some of the normal reactions to the grief losses that we go through. I don't have one or the other that I have in mind when I'm working with people. My framework very much is to be curious about their life, to be curious about their relationship. But I do often will bring these up and share with folks so that it can provide a naming of what they're going through, which comforts them to know that it is normal. There's an author, Alan Wolfett. He's done a lot of work with grief. He's got some really good books for folks that I usually recommend. In processing grief and loss, this framework that he has would be the framework that I would say that the counselors that I work with, that we work through folks the most. If you wanted to put steps to it, if you tried to put a framework on it. So to accept the reality of death or loss. And this is where we hear people say, I can't believe it. You know, it's disbelief, it's shock, it's waking up and not feeling them on that side of the bed, and in that sense of the loss comes fresh over you. So it's beginning to digest that the loss is real, and the permanence of it is something that is takes your breath away. And so it helps doing the work to accept that it is real, that you will not see this person again. To embrace the pain of the loss. So this is allowing yourself to feel all of the emotions that come with grief and mourning. People understandably avoid feeling the pain of the loss because it is so intense. I had a young man I worked with who's lost his whole family probably over about 15 years. And he said, I can't look into that darkness because it is so overwhelming to look into that abyss, if you will. So we oftentimes are working with folks to try to peek in a safe and as much as you can say controlled manner, a supported manner, I should say, begin to embrace the pain of it. One of my coworkers, very wise person, said, you know, you can't go around grief, you can't go under grief, you have to go through grief. And that's where I think we see our role is supporting people as they manage these really, really powerful emotions. Remember the person who died. You know, that's so important about telling stories. People will often say to me, oh my gosh, I tell you the same thing every time I come in. And that's okay. That's part of not only remembering them, but it's also part of processing the acceptance. I love to hear stories about the first time you met, if it's a partner who's lost, or if it's a child who's died. You know, tell me about their birth, tell me about them when they were little, and just to have people have the space to talk about the person, so that they know that it's true, that person existed and mattered, is really so important for people. We'll get into this a little bit towards the end, but I hear people who are supporting grieving people always say, I don't want to bring them up because I don't want to make them sad. And I say to them, I assure you they are already sad, and bringing up the person's name, bringing up stories about the lost actually makes them feel better, because it makes them feel like that person wasn't forgotten, that person mattered, that person had an impact. So it is so important, I think, for a grieving person to have the space to talk about that. Develop a new self-identity. And this is where we kind of look at like adjusting to the new normal. People who have lost spouses after 60 years are adjusting on so many different levels. Maybe the first time they've lived alone, or at least the first time in quite some time that they've lived alone. There was one woman who had the most wonderful husband, and he pumped her gas for her all the time. She had not pumped gas in 30 years. And so it was a big deal for her when she went out, and that was like his love language. She said he'd fill up my tank every Sunday, and she said I never even had to look at it. And so after he died, she had to realize, oh my goodness, she was embarrassed. I don't know how to pump gas. And her son went out and showed her. But you know, there's so much, I think, as partners, oftentimes we take on roles for one another, or as a parent to lose a child. There are so many different, it changes your identity in so many ways. So how do you integrate that loss and then create a new self-identity and move forward in that? Searching for meaning. Interestingly, there's an author, he worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, he was a psychologist, and he has written a book that he said he wants to talk about the 6 stages of grief would be making meaning. So This is a difficult one. So people search for meaning in different ways, whether it's spiritual, whether it is surrounding the death, making meaning of surrounding the death, whether it is, what did this person give to me, and then how can I move forward in a different way? I think it's something that we do as humans, is we search for meaning, and I think that's a very powerful thing that we do. I had a young woman I work with. She cared for her dad. She came in town, cared for her dad right during COVID. And she said, I am so grateful for COVID, because had there not been COVID, he would have been in a nursing home and I wouldn't have been able to care for him. So that's a way to make meaning out of a really terrible situation on many different levels. I'm very careful as a counselor not to impose meaning upon people. So I might, in the back of my mind, as people are telling me their stories, like see a little glimmer of connections where that could be meaning. But that is not my place to connect that. And I think people sometimes can, if people try to make meaning for them, it can be offensive, because it's like, how can you make meaning out of the worst loss of my whole life? So that's one that I think that we search for as humans, but it is delicate. And then receiving and accepting ongoing support for others. And I feel like this is one thing that I work with people a lot about. People sometimes need to be alone when they're grieving, and other times they need to be with people, but it might be where they feel like everybody else has moved on from the loss and they haven't, and so they feel bad asking for support. So really trying to work with folks to identify, who are the people you can go to kind of unconditionally. How can you ask for support when you need it? And then how can you also put boundaries around yourself to protect yourself and to protect your time and energy? We hear so often that energy is so compromised when you're grieving. And so how can you make sure that you're protecting your energy from very well-meaning friends and family? Something that I would add in here is I see a lot of connection between healthy processing of grief and the practice of gratitude. I reflect back to the story I just told you about the young woman who felt gratitude for COVID, for being able to care for her dad in his house and care for him there, and that how that worked out. Grief and gratitude can go hand in hand. And for folks who see the gratitude either in having the person in their life who can feel that gratitude, it feels like to me anecdotally that there is a healthier grieving process. So something when it's appropriate clinically, because certainly it wouldn't be something that I would say, oh, count your blessings, to a poor grieving person. But if we can kind of draw out some of the things that they are telling me that they're grateful for, and they just haven't maybe acknowledged it in that way, that is definitely something that we try and work on. Okay, the many colors of grief. And everything I know, I learned from wonderful people that I work with. And I had this amazing woman, she was a musician, and she talked about the many colors of grief, and that grief isn't just one feeling, it isn't one sensation, it is multifactorial, that there's so much that goes along with it. I want to read you all, if you will humor me, a quote by, and you guys might know this, it's very popular, by C.S. Lewis in A Grief Observed. And I feel like this little paragraph really sums up the different grief reactions and how they impact the whole human. So this is C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. Other times it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There's a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Yet I want others to be around me. I dread moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. And I think though that paragraph does such a wonderful job of describing the physical reactions, the emotional, the cognitive, the social. He really kind of hits it all there. So much of this, I think you all probably know and could speak to the emotional reactions, the sadness, guilt, anxiety, loneliness, feeling, yearning to see the person, seeing, feeling like you're recognizing them in the mall or going about. Some people feeling of relief if the person was suffering, they feel relief that they are no longer suffering. Irritable, there was one person who thought that she needed a pin that said grieving person because she felt like she was the sweetest person. She felt like she was so short with everyone that she wanted to like excuse herself for being so short because she was grieving. So just definitely a myriad of emotional feelings. Fatigue, and I'm not sure if it's emotional fatigue as well as physical. People will talk to me about just how they are so exhausted. They just physically can't get up and get around, and emotionally it's just so hard to get through the day and do the tasks that need to be done. Behaviors, sleep disturbances, appetite disturbances, absent-minded. I had this one very charming woman I worked with who she did water aerobics, and when she went back for her first class after the death of her loved one, she was in the locker room crying and being consoled by her friends, and then she walked from the locker room out to the poolside, and she described it. She said, I wasn't sure if I had my bathing suit on because she was so distracted by her grief that she said, I had to look down and was so grateful that she had put her bathing suit on. Clearly that's a irrational fear, but that was how distracted she felt by her grief, that she wasn't even sure that she had dressed properly. I hear people, worried about like treasuring objects. People sleep with their shirts or might not be able to get rid of the shoes by the door. Loss of schedule and patterns of, I think we talked about sleep, but maybe if you're used to exercising, everything is out the window in terms of the behaviors. Physical sensations. And this is where we talked about the sculpture that I showed you, the feeling, the empty chest. And I hear that so much, that there is a physical feeling of something being missing, or a physical feeling of heaviness on their chest. Tightness in the throat. I think C.S. Lewis talked about that, feeling concussed or drunk and sort of confused. Muscle weakness. A lot of people will have GI issues. I think a lot of people hold their stress in their stomachs, and tension headaches. So definitely a lot of physical sensations. People often will get sick following the death. I've worked with many caregivers who said, oh my gosh, I haven't been sick in a year and a half caring for them. And then their immune system kind of crashes once the person dies. And I think the connection between our emotions and our immune system is real. The cognitive, and this I hear from older folks tend to be very worried about this. They'll tell me like, oh, suddenly I'm so absent-minded, I forget things, I think I have dementia. And clearly I encourage them to talk to their primary care physician, but I also do, put in their mind that grief definitely can be doing this as well. Trouble concentrating. People might feel a presence. People I know have had what you could either call, dependent upon your belief system, either hallucinations or visits from the person, which are very comforting for some people. For some people maybe who don't have that spiritual background, they might feel very frightened by it. So again, that depends upon what their spiritual framework is for life after death. I feel like I'm talking a lot here, guys. How are you doing? Everybody okay? Okay. Okay. So the last couple of slides are just caring for yourself and then caring for others while they're grieving. I think my biggest is express your sorrow and all the other emotions that go along with it. Find a safe space with family, friends. Sometimes people very much would rather be alone to express their grief. I worked with a woman who I thought wisely, she said, I don't like to be around other people when I'm expressing these really intense emotions because I feel like I have to compromise my grief so that they don't worry about me. So she might want to wail, she might want to cry and scream, but if somebody else is around, she might feel like she has to tap that down so as not to worry them. Some people very much want other people to be with them. So to know yourself, to know what is best for you, to express your sorrow. To surround yourself with people who support you in your grief. One of the saddest things is when people, well-meaning or maybe scared of it themselves, really try to limit the time that a person should be grieving. I work with one woman, her husband died in September, and her neighbor saw her a couple weeks ago and said, "How are you doing?" And she said, you know, holidays have been hard without him. And he said, "Oh, come on, it's been 3 months, get over it." And so you don't, I know you don't think people say these, but I can tell you, like, I need to do a workshop on how to work with grieving people, you know, how to be tender to our grieving people in our community. So just to surround yourself for people who support you. And there might be people who are good friends and wonderful people, but they just might not be the person you need to grieve with. And I work a lot with encouraging people to set boundaries with folks who maybe take more energy than they give, and how to gently explain to them that, you know, I need some time, I need some space, and that's okay to do that. I have a lot of folks who express that as a grieving person, sometimes they end up taking care of the person who's trying to console them. And that can be really much a difficult energy suck for them. Take care of your body, eat, drink water, move, stay on a schedule. I have a number of people who end up in the hospital dehydrated because they just forget to forget to drink water, forget to eat. So we work a lot about, even if it's just a protein shake in the morning, you know, half a sandwich, just so as long as you're taking in a little bit at a time. To rest. I worked with one woman who she took care of her mom with Alzheimer's disease. Her mom died, she went right back to work. She was in school full time, and she was raising teenagers. And she said, "Oh my gosh, by the end of the day, I'm so exhausted. I just need to sit in the chair." And she was being hard on herself for feeling like she needed to just sit down, because she was such a go-getter and such a type A person that sitting in the chair and zoning out with some silly TV felt like it was an unnecessary luxury. So talking about listening to your body, resting when you need to rest, keeping a routine is really important. It's probably not really realistic in the very, you know, first couple of weeks following the loss. But I really work with folks in terms of trying to get into a routine, trying to, you know, have a reason to get up and, you know, get changed and, you know, have some breakfast, go for a walk. So keeping a routine, because you need that normality when the world is upside down. What another coworker very wisely said, that sometimes self-care while grieving might not look like self-care prior to the loss. And that's when I talk up to folks about self-care, they're usually like, "Oh yeah, no, I exercise." And I'm like, well, I'm not necessarily talking about exercise. Self-care while grieving might be, yeah, maybe you're not going to go to the gym, but maybe you're doing a gentle walk. Maybe instead of watching TV, you're listening to music. So doing things that are gentle and showing yourself compassion are so important. So I do encourage folks to think outside of the box of what they would do for self-care prior to the grief. It might fit, but it might not. And I really hate it if people are trying to do self-care and the self-care is actually causing more stress than not. So we try and look at it in many different ways and expand the definition of self-care. And then caring for the bereaved. Listen, I think listening is probably the biggest thing. That is pretty much what I do. Listen to folks tell their story, listen to them tell the story of the person's death. That's really important. You know, I think that people always are worried that they don't have the right words for grieving people. You know, I don't know what to say. I didn't know what to say. You know, my thing is sometimes I will literally say, "There are no words. I'm thinking of you," and that just acknowledges the depth of their loss while letting them know that you are thinking about them, and then listening to their stories. Be specific in offers to help. This was something that I actually learned when I worked at the Alzheimer's Association. You know, people would say, "Oh, let me know if I can do anything." And I had one really spunky, wise woman who would pull out her notebook and she'd say, "Okay, this is what I need. You know, could you come by here on Tuesday and take out my garbage?" That's hard to do. She was wonderful and she was very outspoken. And I don't know, I would not be like that. So I encourage the person offering the help to be specific in terms of, you know, may I drop off dinner for you on Sunday? May I mow your lawn? I'm going to drop off some gift cards for dinners for you. So instead of putting it in their lap, to say, to give you something that they will have to think about. They probably feel bad about asking. Be very specific in what you can do for them, and then follow up with it. Try not to make it better. People will say, well, he's in a better place. People might say she's no longer suffering. And while these might be very, very true, it doesn't necessarily bring the individual comfort at that time. What sometimes people feel like, and I've had grieving people say this, is when people say he's in a better place, what they feel like you're telling them is hurry up and feel better, or don't be sad. It's okay. When that's not where they are, it is not okay. Even if they believe that their loved one is in a better place, they're still in the world of grief, and it doesn't necessarily help. And again, grief has no timeline. We can provide some generalizations about, when you might be feeling certain ways. It's not always accurate. There are outliers dependent upon the different variables that we discussed. But maybe to check in, to make a note if your friend loses someone, make a note on your calendar in your iPhone to check in 5 months, to send a card outside of that 3-month window when I think we're all really, really in tune with our friends and family's losses. And then our life starts to go on, but their life might not. They're still really actively grieving. So I think it's important to be aware of that around the holidays, around times to just kind of be mindful of touching base. Saying the name of the deceased, tell stories about them and what they meant to you. And again, I mentioned before, I hear people say, well, I don't want to make them upset. I didn't want to make them sad. But it brings people joy to be able to talk about their loved one. And then I think, again, I said check in, especially after a few weeks or a few months, and ask about their grief. And I think people appreciate that so much, that you are thinking about them still, even a couple of months down the road. I'm thinking about how COVID has impacted so much of this and what we're seeing. And it's complicated, to say the least. The people that we work with who were not able to be by the side of their loved one when they died, who even if they weren't dying of COVID, if they were in a skilled nursing facility or in the hospital, we are anticipating that there will likely be a great number of folks with some very complicated grief. My coworker is working with someone whose husband died, and he was in his 80s of COVID, and she feels like his loss was erased because he was older when he died of COVID, and that he doesn't matter as much as maybe young people who were dying. And she just, it's so important for us to know that he was vibrant, he was gardening, he was doing all of this, and that his death mattered. He's not just a number. So I think COVID is going to, it's just so hard on grieving people. In addition to people who have lost folks due to COVID, some of the people that I work with who are grieving during COVID, it's so isolating. So the things that they used to be able to do, for self-care, going out to lunch with friends, or doing, going for a walk, going to the gym, those are closed off to them now. In addition, when a person is grieving, their whole life has been turned upside down. There is no normal anymore. Pre-COVID, a person might be able to go to work or go out to the mall or go to a restaurant and feel at least a little bit of normalcy. Now what we're seeing is that people feel like the whole world is turned upside down. So nothing is normal anymore, which gives them a feeling of being really untethered and having a really hard time grounding themselves. That said, I have had a couple of people, and these are probably outliers, who feel like COVID has been not bad for their grieving, because they feel like they want to be at home alone, cozy, and not be with folks. So, like I said, with grief, there is no right or wrong. There is not one way to do it. But in general, we find that grieving in the isolation of COVID has been incredibly hard on our folks. And that's why we've moved very quickly. By mid-March, I had put up a online support group to make sure that we have connections and support for our grieving people. I had finished a support group in January, an in-person support group in January of 2019. And so by March, when we knew that we weren't going to be in person, I called up my old support group and I said, hey guys, would you guys be my my test case. And so they were wonderful. And so we worked out Zoom and all of the craziness of it, and used to take us 15 minutes to get logged in, and nobody could hear each other. And we still meet monthly, and we're all good at getting in and getting on. So I think it's really important to adapt and connect as much as you can. When COVID first started, people would call about support groups, and I'd say, I'm sorry, we're doing them on Zoom. And they'd say, no, thank you, no, thank you. Now we're finding that folks are like, you know what, Zoom is okay. I will deal with Zoom. And I find the support groups to be, it's not as great, it's not as nice as in person, but it is pretty darn good. So we're just trying to care for our bereaved in a world of COVID in the best way possible by offering them ways to connect. We do see people, I see people, clients in person with masks and social distancing. So we're trying to be as flexible as possible in that regard. And then finally, if you'll bear with me for one more paragraph, this is probably my favorite grieving quote because I feel like it normalizes, it sums it up in ways that I could never do articulately. Grieving is not a short-term process. It's not even a long-term process. It's a lifelong process. Having a future now means that although your life will flow again, it will flow differently as a result of the loss. Your grief will become incorporated into your life history, become part of your identity, and you will continue now and forever to redefine your relationship with your deceased loved one. Death doesn't end the relationship. It simply forges a new type of relationship, one based on not on physical presence, but on memory, spirit, and love. So I think that is what we are aiming for with healthy grieving, to move people into accepting the loss, to incorporating it. You know, we tell people all the time, you're not going to get over it. You will reconcile it, and the goal would be to move on with a satisfying and meaningful life without that person, while never forgetting them. People often say to me, like, as the grief subsides, you know, they feel guilty that they're feeling better. And, you know, I look at it as, you know, grief and love, and the grief falls away. The love will always stay, and don't feel guilty that the grief fell away. The love, you know, that's normal and natural. It's the love that stays. And I think Ashley Davis Bush does an amazing job of saying that. So that's what I brought for you guys today. I would love to hear comments, experiences, anything, any of your 2 cents that you might have.
I'd like to say thank you. I thought this was really great.
Yeah.
One thing that I guess I had a question or would like your insight on is one of the things I lost my stepdad back in March, right at the beginning of COVID, and our family, it's been hard because every one of us is grieving at a different pace and is in a different spot. So it's been kind of hard for us to talk, to grieve. Well, first of all, it's been hard to grieve together because of COVID, because we're not physically in the same social circles always. So we live kind of far apart. So but then even when we do get together, it's just, we're never at the same spot. So I don't know if you have any insight about that it's just really sometimes hard to deal. I mean, with my mom specifically, because it was my stepdad. And so her and I are just not on the same, we find ourselves not on the same page at all, hardly ever. And I think it's because we're at these differing points all the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are you able to, is it, you know, my first thought would be, are you guys able to reminisce together and tell stories about him together? Is that too painful?
Sometimes it depends. Sometimes, and it's never the same. That's why, like, sometimes she wants to talk about him and I just can't. And then other times I'm okay with it and she's on the moving on, like, not like he didn't exist, you know, like it. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Like you said, you guys are, yeah. And we hear this quite a bit. Oftentimes too, it is the death of a child. Mom and dad might be grieving very differently. And then how do you, how do you support? I'm sure you want to support your mom. I'm sure she wants to support you, but how do you support people when you're not even kind of on the same planet, if you will? I don't know that there is a good answer. I think the thing that I could think about is just like really gentle, honest communication, to name it and to say, hey, mom, I know we're not on the same page. I love you. I know this is different. We had different relationships. How can I support you? And ask her, like, is there a time you want to talk about him, or is it feel better just to go and like get ice cream and distract one another? So as much as possible, I think naming it gently is probably the best, because otherwise I think it's hard when you're like missing each other and then maybe some resentment or some like, frustration. So my suggestion off the top of my head would be just a gentle, and even a written note. Sometimes if there's tension, or if just to like write a note and say, hey mom, I see how you're grieving. Because I think I love written notes. It gives people time. It gives you time to think about what you want to write. It gives her time to think about, how she wants to digest it. But I doubt there's any way to get you guys on the same, but gentle, open communication, I think, is probably the best. Yeah, that's tough. Miss Kate? Jane, can you unmute her? I'm not sure.
You're muted, Kate.
Oh, sorry.
You're still muted.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
Good. Well, this was an incredibly helpful and reassuring and affirming presentation for me, because first of all, my husband and I live in a retirement community that also has a dementia community and a nursing community. And we went into lockdown on March the 12th. And so there was a period of a week and a half when we had the chance to go out, and then immediately we couldn't again. And in this community, we have lost some of the most valued and beloved leaders.
Oh, wow.
And not always because they resigned. And we've lost community members, and we've had lots of COVID scares. And so there are just lots and lots of adjustments that have had to be made. And we're very far from, we haven't had dinner together for 11 and a half months. It's just been very weird. But everything that you say has been helpful to me, and really confirmed my decision to just take this time to take care of myself. The other thing that's been going on is that a month and a half before the virus was declared, our daughter was found to have a terminal brain tumor. So long story short, she is now in hospice care, and she has caregivers, and my family have been incredibly helpful, but I haven't been able to go over and take care of her. I had an experience of a couple of days of compassionate care leave. But I have had the luxury of lots of time and energy to do some of the things that you've been talking about here. And I'm really grateful to hear you saying that these are good things to do. And the third thing that strikes me is that as a country, I think we've been going through a traumatic, devastating grieving process in these recent weeks. And maybe because I have these other things going on, I don't know, but I find myself feeling afraid at times and feeling distracted by that and thinking that it's connected to the other two things.
Mhm.
And the long and short of it is, I go to a support group every day. I exercise every day. I take naps every day. I have a small faith group I meet with every week. I have a family Zoom group. I do meditation. And really, I just told myself at the beginning, you have no agenda.
Mhm.
You don't have to accomplish anything during this time. And it has been such a helpful and freeing decision.
Perspective. Mhm.
So I'm just really, it feels like what you've said, Marjorie, has really reinforced
Good.
what I've experienced.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, by all means. My thoughts are with you, with your daughter, definitely.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I was struck at the very beginning that, what we sort of wish grief would be like this straight line and then all the curlicues and back and forth, because I constantly find that. It's 3 years now, a little over 3 since my husband died. And at first it was kind of what you expect. And all of a sudden you think you're kind of on a smooth path and then something just comes back and hits you in the face with it.
Mhm.
And you're in this other feeling of grief, more like the beginning feeling again.
Yeah.
And then you go round and round some more again. So it's always unexpected.
Yeah. And I asked Connie, people, I think you put your finger on it, when folks, people will be worried that if they have one of those days that feels like the beginning day, they'll say, oh, I've gone backwards, or I'm not healing. And be able to reassure them that that is too part of the process. And it doesn't mean you're going back again and once again to point that it's not linear. It's more like waves up and down. And sometimes a wave will crash out when you didn't even expect it.
Right. It's the unexpected ones
Yes.
sometimes.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you, Connie.
Yeah. Sometimes a hymn at church will just strike me, and it's
Hmm.
not even a hymn that had a particular association sometimes, but there's something about it. Sometimes it's just the melody or the words.
Yeah.
Hits you again.
Yep.
I really
Judy?
appreciated your comments on what to say to people, because there are no words. And I've heard people say really silly things. Like I was in a line one time to greet a young woman who lost her mother, and it was very sudden that she had an asthma attack and she died. This was it's probably 5 or 6 years ago. Anyway, so the person in front of me says to this young woman, "Oh, she's in a better place." And the young woman said back to her, "No, she'd rather be here." So I thought, good on you. I mean, because people say things that are just stupid.
Yep.
And so I've often thought it's best to say nothing, or just say, "I'm so sorry for your grief."
Mhm.
What a wonderful woman she was. I'm so sorry. Anything, but she's in a better place. Just every time I just.
Oh yeah. And I think I agree with you, Judy. I think it's our instinct to try and make things better, or to try and make people feel better, when we just have to accept that there's nothing that we can say or do that will make them feel better, except for maybe, unconditional, quiet support, and even that won't make them feel better. It just won't make them feel worse. Yep.
Anyway.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
I want to jump in here and have you all meet Lisa O'Connell, who's here. Wave, Lisa. Thank you. So Lisa's on with us today. Lisa is a hospital chaplain currently at Jewish and will be leading our session in 2 weeks now. Originally, it was scheduled for the 20th, but Judy prompted me that it's inauguration day, so we don't want to have anything taking us away from our screens so we can be cheering.
Mhm.
So we've rescheduled that one for the 27th at 1 o'clock again. That will be on the spiritual aspects to attend to for the dying person and for the caregiver. And then it's not scheduled yet, but we want to add a 5th session on planning your own funeral. So that will be advertised soon about what day and time. It'll be a Wednesday in this time slot, still part of the series in a couple of weeks. So Marjorie, on behalf of everyone, thank you. This was very, very excellent and helpful. I did record this, everyone, so let me know if there are people that missed it and you mentioned that you were there. Tell them they can get a hold of me and I can send them the link to see this recording.
Oh, thank you for saying that, Jane, because I was thinking of Mary Jo Blankemeyer, and I don't think she was, but this early on, when I was able to be very focused, there were things, in fact, I took pictures of some of the slides from that Marjorie presented to share with Mary Jo.
Oh,
And I think she would very much appreciate the recording.
okay.
And even those of us who have been able to be here, may we access the recording as well?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
I'll send you the link too, so you can send that out to other people.
I would be grateful. Thank you, Jane.
Sure,
And
sure.
Thank you, Marjorie.
Yeah, this is,
Oh, thank you guys. And Jane, feel free to, I think you have a copy of the PowerPoint. I think I only tweaked 1 or 2 words on there, so feel free to share too as needed for that as well.
okay, great, great.
Thanks for the
Thank you
opportunity.
for
you all.
all. Yes, well, thanks for being there, and we're glad to know that you're there at
you.
hospice.
Yep. Thank you guys. Take care. Be well, everyone.
Okay,
Thank you.
Bye now.
thanks so much. Bye.
Okay. And thank you, Jane, for organizing these. Very
You are
good.
welcome.
Oh,
Happy to do it.
Thank you very
Jane,
much,
this is
Jane.
just,
Happy to do it. No, it's
I
important.
think this,
Kate,
I
go
think
ahead.
this series has um, been one of the most helpful and powerful works, offerings that the parish has ever done.
Well, good. We did something similar. Actually, Janet Montgomery herself did a series for us. It's probably 8 or 9 years ago. We did it over at the
isn't that
Cintas
long.
Center.
There
Hmm?
was a session met on Tuesday nights in the Cintas. I think it's only 3 or 4.
Oh,
It was
don't.
very, and Janet Paquin and rather Janet Montgomery and somebody Paquin and I forget a third person. We had 3 weeks and they were
Mhm.
excellent. It was excellent. And that in some measure prompted me to try to reserve this time today. Or